Educational Communications and this station present Environmental Directions with Nancy Perlman. On this series, we explore the effects of human influence on the Earth's ecosystems and discuss solutions to environmental problems which affect the quality of life on this planet. Environmental Directions gives you the kind of information you need to help you participate in decisions impacting your community, the nation, and the world. Now, here's your host, Nancy Perlman.
Hello, my guest is Patty Olinger. She is Executive Director of the Global Biorisk Advisory Council, which is a division of the International Sanitary Supply Association. And she is also the current convener for the Society's TC 212 Working Group 5, which is creating international standards for protection. Welcome. It's a pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you, Nancy. It's a pleasure to be here.
Your organization is obviously very involved in trying to help communities and facilities, industries, schools reopen safely because of the COVID pandemic. Is it possible? Are we going to be able to do it?
We can. It's a combination of our work practices and due diligence, and then the behaviors on individuals to be able to then follow those procedures right now, really to the letter of the law or to the detail.
Your association was formed over 92 years ago as the National Sanitary Supply Association. What has changed in all these years? The kind of chemicals used for cleaning or our awareness of the need for better sanitation?
You know, if you look at just the whole history of sanitation, it goes back to even before ISSA was formed. It really goes back to even the late 1800s, where we saw a real connection between sanitation and health back with cholera and the smallpox. We saw the international, basically, rules and regulations change. During that time, we also saw, between then and now, a lot of medical interventions coming up, the invention or the discovery of antibiotics, vaccines. We shifted at some point to what we're seeing now with COVID, is that shift from the acceptance of it looks pretty and it smells nice to really verifying and validating that we have hygienic cleaning. And so we are removing deadly pathogens. And how do we ensure that we're doing that? And then on top of that, how we validate. And it's really to bring back that confidence for individuals who are in the field, individuals who are customers and our clients, and really the general public and community as a whole.
Sometimes I think Americans have taken cleanliness in a very strange way to the extreme, where we're actually causing more problems when we're starting to use antibacterial soaps when we don't have a bacterial infection, and then we're weakening the resistance for
You know, if you look at the regulatory framework, that was the case for a while, but then our regulators actually removed that from the ability on the general public. And so the hand soaps that used to be antibacterial, you really can't get them unless you're in an actual healthcare institution nowadays. That was a concern. And it's not just the United States, it's really worldwide. It's like, what is it that we really need to be doing? And really doing that due diligence from a standpoint of what we call a risk assessment, and then determining what it is that you're going to utilize. And I have been environmental health and safety for all of my career. While you look at what you need to do, and right now it's deactivation of the COVID-19 or the SARS-CoV-2 virus, but we also want to take into consideration the health and wellness of those who are doing the cleaning and disinfection. And also, are there residuals? And what is, as you indicated, what's that ramification of what we're using going forward?
You mentioned Biorisk, and you're involved internationally. Is the standard different in other parts of the world than in the United States?
Sure. I mean, every country has their own standards. Some of it is based on what goes on in those countries. You look at UK, the European Union, WHO guidelines. Some countries are very well developed, like Canada and United States, the UK and Australia, and others, Japan. And then some are kind of in the middle. They're in the developing of their standards. Then some don't have standards. But when you look at it from a standpoint of, I don't want to say common sense, but in lieu of not having something, a lot of people look to places like WHO for guidance.
The United Nations World Health Organization.
Absolutely. And those other countries like the U.S. Center for Disease Control, CDC, or Health Canada, again, the United Kingdom. We look at those countries who have well-developed systems and then able to then say, how can we utilize some of those controls that are in place?
Here in the United States, we do have the resources, the soaps, the clean water, the cleaning supplies to be sure that our environment is safe for us. And yet I've traveled throughout the world where people don't have clean water. They're still getting diseases drinking and bathing in dirty water. Is an organization like yours working to try and bring these other places into the modern world of sanitation so that they have decent facilities to clean themselves?
That's a really good question. And it really, if you look at some of the challenges, let's say clean water, what the different organizations around the world are doing for that. And I've, like you, traveled all over the world and into developing countries and back into areas that are not what you would consider modern running water and electricity and that. Those types of situations, they are challenged with how they can do things. And there are a lot of organizations such as ISSA that work together with other governmental agencies to help provide programs so that there are resources as well as educational programs to help folks in those areas.
You're involved with supplying sanitary items. What are those exactly?
So ISSA actually is a trade association and nonprofit. We have over 10,000 members in about 105 different countries. So it can be anything from paper towels, microfiber towels, to cleaning and disinfection, sanitization, chemicals and chemistry, to equipment from mops and buckets, to electrostatic sprayers, to devices that we're starting to see. And then the manufacturers, distributors, service providers, and also the organizations that utilize those services. So it's a very diverse group. It's interesting because what we're seeing now, especially after the pandemic has started, is we're seeing a lot of innovation, robotics and automation, and some really interesting and what I would say cool technologies that are starting to come to the market, and some of them are going to stick. And I think we'll be better and safer in the long run because of those. If there's a silver lining to the SARS-CoV-2 virus or the COVID-19 pandemic, that will be one of the silver linings, I think, going forward.
Is there a product from the past that people used to think was safe and we shouldn't use anymore?
That's a hard one to answer. I would say if you look at some of the things that we've used in the past, let's say 30, 40 years ago, for instance, to disinfect a room, we used to use formaldehyde. And we don't do that anymore. We know that there are better products out there. It's not to say that it's not effective. Obviously, we know it's effective, but there's health considerations, and it's carcinogenic and it has a residual. There's things that we've learned over time that you don't want to utilize, and there are better products out there that we can choose from.
During this pandemic, a lot of people are buying disinfectants. Are they really the solution to keeping our surfaces clean? It's
part of the solution. We look at it from a standpoint of, I always talk about like a stool. You know, it has legs of that stool. You have the SOPs and the standard operating procedures that are in place. You have the chemistry, you have the equipment, and you have the operator. And you really want those four legs of that stool in balance. And that operator needs to be well trained. For example, you bring up disinfectants or cleaners. If they're not reading the back of that label, and let's say the back of the label says to be effective, you need to have a dwell time of 5 minutes or 10 minutes, what that means is the surface needs to stay wet for that period of time for it to be effective. A lot of people don't read that label. They just spray and wipe. And so it's really not as effective as it is intended to be. And so being in balance, no matter what chemistry you're using or piece of equipment or SOPs or training or the operator, you need to have all of those things working together.
Reading labels is so important, and I know here in the United States there's so many different products that we use this to clean the oven, use this to clean the toilet, use this to clean the shower stall, use this to clean the floor. Sometimes I think, isn't it just good old soap and water and elbow grease is all we need?
Well, that's a good cleaner from a standpoint of you're removing that biological material. If that's all you have, I mean, water is the best solvent out there. It's the most abundant, and you flush the area, you remove, and sometimes that's all we have available to us, and it's better than not doing anything.
But the labels indicate you shouldn't mix some of these various cleaning products because it can be poisonous, the fumes, and so often some of the cleaning people are from other countries. They don't read or speak English very well, and they're making dangerous combinations.
Oh, absolutely, and we've seen that, well, in history, and where someone takes, we'll say, bleach, and they mix it with an ammonia, and that is not a good combination and can be very toxic. And we don't realize that sometimes. You're absolutely right. That's where here in the United States, and again, those developed countries like the UK or Canada, they have programs in place. Ours would be something what we would call underneath our Occupational Health and Safety, OSHA, guidelines for hazard communication, where that employer needs to make sure that their employees understand how to utilize it and those concerns and questions that may come up with some of these, with the requirements, for example, for personal protective equipment while using those chemistries.
You're working internationally to try and prevent our exposure to infectious disease. You are part of this working group. What is the international standard? Is the standard high enough?
That's a little tough to answer from a standpoint of when we start working with infectious diseases, you really need to have what we call a performance-based approach. And so again, you do your risk assessment and you determine what you need to have in place to protect you, to protect people around you in your environment and your communities. With SARS-CoV-2, we know it as airborne. We know that it is also on surfaces. If I'm going into a known situation, what type of personal protective equipment, mitigation strategies, we'd call them, that we need to put in place. I was involved very heavily with the Ebola outbreak in 2014, and the requirements that we would put in place for the Ebola outbreak were different, similar in some respects, but different than for the SARS-CoV-2. It's not as easy as what we would like to say. It's not black and white, but it is a performance-based, and there's a lot of experience out there with this type of virus, and we utilize that history from that to be able to then put programs in place and work with individuals and organizations and governments even to help respond to this outbreak.
Going back to our opening question, going back to what we began our discussion with, and that is reopening safely during this pandemic. What needs to be done?
Yeah, it is a partnership and a plan and a strategy. So it depends upon your situation. If it's a school, again, doing that risk assessment and identifying those high-risk situations and putting in place those controls or those work practices that can help people reopen. If it's a convention center, we can look at, again, what types of work practices, where are the high-risk situations that we need to either mitigate, change, control. Restaurants, you indicated so many. What we're finding is that everybody is affected here, and it's not as easy to say, oh, we just need to do this, because what's right for this organization or this type of discipline, but at the end of the day, as an individual, I talk about the 3 W's, wear your masks, wash your hands, and watch your space between people and recognize those high-risk situations and make sure that you are putting in place those controls in those high-risk situations.
I'm hearing different reports that airline travel is safe, and then some say it's not safe. Are they really cleaning those planes, and is the air really circulating that it is safe to get back on the plane?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the one thing that the studies that have recently come out from the U.S. Department of Defense and collaboration I believe it was with United Airlines, and it really is applicable to the other major airlines as well, is that, number one, the air that's in that airplane that's recirculated goes through a HEPA filter system. The other thing is that what they showed is that when you release an aerosol of, let's say, a similar type, a way to be able to mimic the SARS-CoV-2, and they looked at masked versus non-masked situations, and they used different types of nebulizers and different ways to collect the samples. They showed that, number one, it was very safe. The likelihood of infection, if you're wearing a mask, was very unlikely. The other thing, when you look at infection rates of airline employees, it's extremely low compared to everybody else. And most of the infections that did happen happened way early in the pandemic, and it was when we weren't wearing masks. So the airline itself, travel, is one of the safest situations that you can be in, which is kind of odd because we're all in there together. But it shows the importance of wearing a mask, for one thing. And yes, they are putting in place a lot of controls and a lot of procedures for cleaning and disinfection. The other thing is the airports themselves. They are looking at, we're working with a lot of airports around the world, but it's from gate to gate or even curb to curb. That whole transition for that travel, looking at that whole journey for passengers and for travelers, making sure that they feel comfortable and making sure that what's in place can keep people safe.
Since your organization has suppliers of sanitary items, and we are all so involved now in making sure that our facilities, homes are safe and sanitized, they must be doing very well economically. Are they donating back to nonprofit organizations that are helping people in need during this pandemic?
Absolutely, and I can give you an example. Kimberly-Clark donated, or they provided a grant for $500,000 for individuals to go through training. And to ISSA, being a nonprofit, they're in the process of taking part of those funds to provide to K through 12 schools the ability to go through our accreditation programs and supporting them that way. You've had others who are looking at those types of grants, working with those frontline workers, first responders, and donating time, in-kind donation, as well as supporting training and education opportunities for those frontline workers.
I want to thank you so very much for reminding us about what we need to do and how we can safely move about in the current situation. Thank you for being my guest.
Thank you, Nancy, for having me.
I have been speaking with Patty Olinger, who is Executive Director of the Global Biorisk Advisory Council, a division of the International Sanitary Supply Association. I'm Nancy Perlman. Thank you very much for joining us, and do tune in again next week.
If you would like free information about these environmental issues, go to www.ecoprojects.org or call 310-559-9160. Environmental Directions with your host, Nancy Perlman, is a community affairs program of the nonprofit organization Educational Communications and this station.